Welcome back to the table. Today, Ryan and I are going to give you a look at Omerta, the Five Families. This is the newest game from Vesuvius Media. And while it looks like an area control game, it is to some degree, but there's a lot of other things that you're going to be sort of calculating, not in any given game, but this game has scenarios that are kind of unique in that it's not like campaign narrative type scenarios. They're more like scenarios based on what kind of game you want to play and how many players you have at the table.
Right. Area control and area majority is definitely a big part of the game. In fact, controlling different areas is going to give you some benefits during the game, but winning the game is not necessarily about that area control. Like David said, you can pick that scenario based on kind of how you want to play, but also by how many players are at the table. So when David and I are playing with 2 players, we have very specific scenarios to choose from that allow us to play 2-player games. Same with 3, 4, ultimately 5 players. In fact, there's one scenario that plays just for 4 players.
Yes.
So based on what player count you kind of have a little bit of variety. And those scenarios are going to set up the board in a very specific way, but also give you very specific goals. We've seen some scenarios where everybody's competing for the same end goal, like controlling a certain amount of territories. We've seen scenarios where it's a very specific goal for each family that they're trying to complete something a little bit asymmetric to the other players. So these scenarios are definitely going to change. Anything that we talk about here in this video can be changed by introducing new rules, gameplay mechanics, and ultimately goals that are brought in by those scenario cards.
Yeah, and we're dwelling on the scenarios so much at the beginning here because of like what Ryan just outlined. This is not a campaign game, so when you hear scenarios, don't think it's anything like that. This just gives you a bunch of different varieties of how to approach the game. And in the game that we played around with, it was a 2-player specific. Now, there's not just one of those. There's a scenario for 2 to 3. There's a scenario for 2 to 5. We did the one that is strictly 2 players, and it was only 60 minutes. And it actually affected more than just the win conditions, but also the very game itself. The game is going to be structured with a number of different steps and phases that you go through, and we actually eliminated some of those phases.
Well, for sure. A big aspect of this game, when you play with higher player counts, there's a level of negotiation that happens in the game, and this is kind of a core concept of the game. You'll see here the board laid out in front of us. We start with very specific control. Now, normally, you might start with just like one area that you control or one, like sector. I have all of Manhattan, a section. We control a little bit more. You're also going to see this family relations track up here at the top of the board with all of these different tokens that demonstrate the different pairings between families. Of course, sometimes you're not going to use all these tokens because not every family is at the table, but a big part of the game can be negotiating whether or not you're anywhere from an ally to being hostile or even at war with some of the other players at the table. Of course, in a 2-player game, when it's just 2 players, the only option we have, we're at war. We start the game off at war. This is a very highly PvP-focused scenario where our only goal is to attack each other and take terrain or areas away from each other, which sounds right up David's alley.
Yeah, not exactly up my alley, but it is interesting because, like I said, it does impact. The whole commissions, which is phase B of the game, is taken completely out of it. That is when you would do those negotiations. Every scenario, though, is going to start with the storyline. The storyline is also going to be dictated by whichever scenario you're playing. You're always playing a scenario of this game, and you're going to get out certain number of cards. This is going to have some impact. Ours had 3, so that means there's going to be 3 rounds of the game. There can be more. There can actually even be early and late if you play longer games. But these are going to be dictated. The order is going to be generally dictated. You flip it over, it's going to have some impact on the game. It's going to generally set like, during this round, here's the situation. In fact, you can see here, the War of the Oranges makes it so that we're going to put out extra markers in some of the areas. And in those areas, there's going to be more casualties in this round.
Yeah, it's to discourage you from just flat out destroying each other in the very first round. But yeah, you're going to flip over one of those every round, and it's going to give you, like David said, the goal for that round particularly, and regards to where you're going to be putting out these scenario tokens. And then you actually you play through all the steps regardless. And I will tell you kind of just like what you're trying to do in the game a little bit. There's a action phase where you're going to be taking a lot of actions, and at the end of that round, you're going to be adjusting and kind of gaining income based on what you control. That income is kind of crux to the game, because there are a lot of things you're going to be spending money on. And in fact, the first 3 kind of phases of the game all involve spending money. You're going to be using that money to bribe the police. You can potentially move the police marker into areas to kind of protect it. You're going to be bribing the newspapers to give you a little bit more respect. And you're going to be using that money to pay for capos. So all three of these things do require money. So you are kind of driven, even if area control is not the objective of your scenario, you do want to have the most money possible to spend on all those different things.
Yeah, in fact, some of the scenarios that we talked about earlier, one of the asymmetric goals for one of the families is just to get their income and their racketeering level up as high as it can be. Once they reach a certain point, they win the game, while the other ones are completely different. The other interesting thing about this game, across all of the things Ryan just said, some have some reveals, some don't. And one of the cooler reveal moments is that police and newspaper bribing. It is one of the phases of the game, and everyone's going to put an amount of money in their right hand and left hand. Left hand is going to be the newspapers, and the right hand is going to be the police. And you reveal one of them, and they're going to have impacts on the game. The newspapers, basically, you're paying off the newspapers. You're going to have better reputation. It's good for you to have paid them off. Of course, if you are lowest on that, it's going to be bad for you. You're going to lose respect. Now, on the police side of things, it's a little bit more interesting. The police side is going to dictate where you are on this police tract. Whoever bids the highest is going to get this position, and so on and so forth down the line. This is going to have a couple of different impacts. One of the things is that you can put out this police token if you're the highest bidder. You put this in any of the areas, and then in that area, it allows effectively you or your family to do all sorts of things, and none of the other players to do many of those things.
It blocks a lot of your actions that you can potentially take in that zone. The other reason that it's good to be lower on this police track is you'll get an advantage against other players. You can call in police backup if you're fighting against them. Which, of course, this is a mafia-style game. You are going to be having some conflict, which we'll talk about. There is combat that can take place between players. Every time there's combat, you're going to look at that track. If you have, if you're higher on the police track than them, you get a bonus. It doesn't even matter if you're first. It just matters that you're higher than the player you're fighting. Of course, in a two-player game, it does matter because it's just the two of us.
Exactly.
But in a five-player game, you could be fourth on this track and still get an advantage against the player that's fifth.
Well, not to mention, if you're first, you're going to get an advantage against every other player.
Yeah, that's a huge benefit when it comes to combat, which is one of the actions you're going to take. Of course, that combat strength is going to be dictated by your capos, and we talked a little bit about that a second ago. You are spending money on capos, but again, this is done in an interesting way because the value of capos changes as people spend money. Once you get up to a certain point on the capos track, the value of the capo changes from $10,000, which is, that's the basic $1,000 currency, to $20,000. So the player that gets to buy capos first can buy as many as they want for $10,000 a piece. And then other players might have to spend $20,000 if they've bought too many. It's kind of the supply and demand, I guess, of capos looking for work out in New York in the 20s. Eventually, they're going to start asking for more money.
Yeah, and that is only in effect when you are in the recruit phase, when you're getting those capos. There are some other times where you can do just about any of the things that you might see in each of these phases. But during the recruit phase, you're getting those capos like Ryan just said, but you're also able to purchase these action cards. And these action cards are going to come into play in a couple different parts of the game. One, during the action phase, which we've kind of touched on here and there, there's a lot of different actions you can take. One of those actions is to play one of those cards. Like many games, these cards are going to have like a very maybe more unique element to what you're doing other than the standard things that you can do. But you can also use those action cards during battle, which we haven't talked about. But in the actions that you can take, one of the things you can do is move into a territory and battle if you want. But if you do battle, it's going to go through a step of, a sequence step of how you resolve that and how casualties are taken care of.
Yeah, I think, the actions that you're taking in this game, that is kind of the meat and potatoes of what you're doing. You're getting to take some number of actions on your turn, and each of these action cost action points. And a lot of those things are kind of what you'd expect, being able to move into different zones, being able to attack, being able to influence some of these different tracks, being able to play action cards. All of those things cost action points, but you're not getting a set number of action points per turn. It's actually based on these plot cards. Each family is going to have a number of these plot cards that have both a kind of a generic effect and a effect if that plot card is for your family.
Yeah.
I'm playing the Geovese family, and so if I play a card with a Geovese effect, I get that benefit. You can play one of these plot cards, so it's going to give you some kind of benefit for the round, potentially, but it's also going to determine what your action point number is for the turn. And I've seen anywhere from like 2 to like 3 to 5 potential actions that you'll get based on these plot cards.
Yeah, you're also going to get a variety of these depending on the scenario you play.
Yeah.
We played this one, and in this 2-player scenario, you're only ever getting early anything.
Yeah.
So there's actually early plot cards. There's also late game plot cards, which are not in our 2-player scenario. So if you're going to play maybe a full 5-player game, you're going to see some cards in there that you probably didn't see in other games.
And once you've kind of determined your plot card, that's when you're actually going to take actions. And player order is determined by the income phase, which at the end of every round you're going to kind of readjust. But on your turn, you get to take actions. And like we said, spending those action points, there's a whole list of actions you can do. Things like moving and fighting and starting combat. You can put your godfather out on the board. You can add some businesses to the board. And you can engage in both legal and illegal activities, which you'll see here. There is a chart which is going to kind of increase as you decide to take either legal or illegal activities. You're going to get benefits. Every time you hit one of these highlighted areas, you're going to get to add something to the board. So kind of going up and down one of those tracks could be helpful. But again, you are spending action points to do that, which means you have less action points to actually interact with the board state or play those action cards.
Yeah, those actions in particular also are the ways that you can actually grab some income off the income phase. So during the game, if you're wanting to string out some of your actions that you have left to take, you might go over here and do one of these so that you can immediately get a little bit more money so that then you can take one of those other actions that require money, such as building a business, and you put a business in one of the territories where you have presence.
Yeah, and the main way that you're going to get income is during the income phase, but like David said, sometimes you just need a little bit of income right away because some of these action cards require you to spend money. Some of these actions, like putting a business down, require you to spend money. So you're kind of in this ebb and flow constantly of trying to make back the money that you have lost. But I will say, all the other actions aside, probably the core thing you're doing a lot in this game is that moving and attacking phase.
Yeah.
If you don't have your godfather or your street boss on the board, you have to add them to the board at the very start of your action phase, and then you're free to kind of take actions. Each one of these is going to replace one of your capos. You can add those capos to your board, and like if we had played through that capos phase, we might actually have a few more on here as we spent money to recruit them. But you can only have 7 total capos in any one space, so you can't just like gang up on someone. But unlike a lot of these games, I think it's worth noting that you're never required to fight.
Right.
You can move into spaces and then decide that you're not. So I could move these guys into a space and not have a fight if I don't want to have a fight. Now, there's some benefits to moving into different spaces, and there's some, based on that family relations, whether or not somebody is an ally or hostile. Allies give you free passage. Hostiles, you have to stop your movement there and things like that. So there are some movement restrictions, and again, that's where negotiation at the table is going to kind of come into play. Like, hey, I'm moving my guys in here, but I'm not going to fight. Don't worry. I'm not coming for you. I'm just moving through you. Of course, they could ambush you, right? There's nothing holding you to that. So there is a level of like reading the table and negotiating that goes into this action phase.
For sure. There's alliances and betrayals. And when Ryan was talking about that limitation of 7, it is a limitation on 7 strength.
Yeah.
And there is varying strength across these different units. The capos have the same strength, but your street boss and your godfather are going to have increased strength. So those areas are going to be tougher, but they're going to also be targets because you want to try to take those things out. And as you resolve the battles, there's a pecking order. If you do enough casualties to someone, they have to take their godfather out first, then their street boss, and so on. Plus, in the bigger game, which we really haven't touched on totally, there's also legacy. There's respect and legacy. And in the bigger game, sort of the end-all, be-all game that you can play with up to 5 players, you can win by either getting to 10 legacy or 7 respect. Legacy is going to be associated with a number of things, but mainly you're going to have some of these legacy cards in your hand that allow you to score significant amounts of legacy if something happens. For instance, I have one here that says control 3 areas where a godfather or street boss from another family is. So, like Ryan said, I could move in a bunch of strength there, or a bunch of even just capos.
Yeah.
Where you may have left your godfather. I don't know that you would do that.
Abandon your godfather alone.
It would be a tricky thing to do, but it is the kind of thing that you can kind of all of a sudden just go, oh, okay, I'm going to do this 3 legacy.
Yeah.
And 3 legacy, when you're just trying to get 10, can be a very quick thing to do to trigger the end of the game.
Yeah, for sure. Now, combat is, like I said, not required, and it's not like there's a combat phase in the game. It's not like you get done with your actions and all of a sudden you move on to a combat phase. Combat can happen when you move as part of the move. So if I were to move in here with my street boss, then I could declare that I was attacking David, and then we immediately move into a combat right then, which you don't see any dice in this game. There is no combat tracker. It's purely deterministic. You have a strength when you move in, then you have action cards. And these action cards have two parts. David mentioned that you can play, or we mentioned that you can play some of these action cards for their action, but they're double-sided, or not double-sided, but split, I would say. The bottom is usually some kind of action, and then the top is some kind of benefit in combat. If you don't want to use this action card for its action, you can play it face down and reveal it in the combat to increase your strength. So while it is deterministic, there is never a sure thing. When you're looking at an opponent that has several action cards in their hand, you don't know if they're going to want to commit those into combat because it is a choice. Maybe winning that combat is important, but you might lose an action that you were planning on taking because you don't get these cards back after they're used for combat.
Yeah, it is, like I said, a game of reveals. There's a number of points where you're going to be revealing that. And of course, that makes perfect sense in a game of alliances and broken alliances. And one of the things we kind of glossed over, and that's mainly because the two-player Strictly game didn't have it, was that commission phase. In the commission phase, you're doing those sort of negotiations, and in player order, you're going to basically look to every player at the table and say, do I want to keep it the same with you? Do I want to improve it with you? Or do I want it to go south with you? And it's up to you if you want it to stay the same or for it to go south. And you're just really moving your relationship with them one space. You're never moving giant movements with them. The last option is to improve. If you improve your relationship with someone, you have to come to that agreement. And this can be done with, like, I won't attack you here. If you'll do this, I'll do this. You can do all sorts of things. Of course, you can break those terms as well.
Yeah, which means, of course, no one's going to listen to you.
Yes.
But that's important because when it does come to combat, you're actually incentivized to not attack your allies. So if you've made a deal with somebody where they're an ally and then you attack them in combat, you actually lose 3 respect.
Yes.
Which can be a lot, especially when you're trying to play to 7 respect. That's half of your respect. So you generally don't want to attack your specific ally. However, you might have a legacy card that wants you, it might be beneficial to you. So you can never be 100% feeling safe that somebody won't attack you, even if you are allies, but you can kind of hope that negotiating that allyship at least gives you a little bit of protection.
Right. No one likes a backstabber.
Right, exactly.
This is the point in most of our videos where we would say the game is going to end like this, but like we said earlier, depending on what scenario you're playing, it's going to end in a variety of different ways. They're really, really interesting. I'm putting up an image right now to show you some examples of some of those, but like Ryan said earlier, some of them are asymmetric. The big one is reach 10 legacy or 7 respect, things like that. But the game's going to end eventually after X number of rounds in the game, or if someone hits those things. That is Omerta, the 5 families. There's a lot to this game. This is definitely going to be one of those games where I think if people are into those sort of like really aggressive head-to-head games, obviously with a little bit of negotiation, I don't think this is going to have a lot of heavy, prolonged negotiation.
I think that's going to be a table thing. If your table really leans into it, maybe you will really enjoy that part of it.
It is always up to the players at the table, or at least those 2 players who want to negotiate for an hour long. But anyway, if you have any questions at all about the game, please make them in the comments below. We'll get down there and try to answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.